His father was the most powerful admiral in American history, the man who won the war in the Pacific. So when Chester Nimitz Jr. took a submarine into Japanese waters in 1944, he carried a name that could crush a man. He did not hide behind it. He sank enemy destroyers, earned the Navy Cross, and built a life entirely his own. And then, at the very end of a long and decorated life, the son of Admiral Nimitz made one final, deliberate, deeply controversial decision, together with the woman he had loved for more than 60 years. This is the whole of it. To be the son of Chester Nimitz was to live your whole life in the largest shadow the United States Navy ever cast, the father. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded millions of men and the greatest fleet ever assembled, and his face was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. A boy growing up under that name had two choices: be crushed by it or go and earn his own. Chester Jr. chose to earn his own in the most dangerous branch of the wartime Navy, beneath the surface of the sea, where his father had also once served as a young man. What he did under that water in 1944 would have made any father proud, and what he did with the 60 years afterward is a story of quiet success almost no one knows. But it is the final chapter that makes people stop and argue, a choice about how a life should end that still divides those who hear it. To understand that choice, you first have to meet the man, not the Admiral's son, but the submarine captain who went hunting the enemy in the South China Sea. Go back to early 1944. In February 1944, on his own 29th birthday, Chester Nimitz Jr. took command of the submarine USS Haddo. A submarine command in that war was among the deadliest jobs the Navy offered. The boats slipped alone into enemy waters, hunted ships far larger than themselves, and 1 in 5 never came back. The famous last name guaranteed him nothing down there. The sea did not care who his father was. Either he could find the enemy, attack without flinching, and bring his crew home, or he could not. Over the months that followed, in the South China Sea, he proved that he could. On a single war patrol in the late summer of 1944, Chester Jr. and the Haddo tore into Japanese shipping. In a series of attacks in enemy-controlled water, his torpedoes sank 2 Japanese destroyers and a large escort vessel and badly damaged a third, sending nearly 15,000 tons of enemy ships to the bottom. Then the hunters became the hunted. The surviving enemy escorts came after the Haddo in fury, raining depth charges that hammered her hull while the crew sat in the dark and the silence, and waited to see if the next one would split boat open. They held. For that patrol he was awarded the Navy Cross. There is a quiet symmetry in it. Decades earlier, his father had begun his own career in the Navy's first primitive submarines, learning the dangerous new craft of undersea war. Now the son commanded a far deadlier version of the same machine, against a real enemy. The father directed the entire Pacific from a headquarters in Hawaii, moving fleets across an ocean. The son fought the war 1 torpedo at a time in a steel tube 300 feet down, listening to enemy propellers grind past overhead. Same name, same Navy, same submarines, 2 completely different wars. And the son never once asked his father for a favor. What happened to that submarine captain after the shooting stopped is where his story turns from war into something more personal and finally more difficult. We are getting to it, because Chester Nimitz Jr. came home from the Pacific alive, one of the lucky submariners, with a wife he adored and a future wide open. He could have traded on his father's name for the rest of his life. Instead, he spent the next half-century proving, over and over, that he was nobody's shadow. And the way he chose to end that life, decades later, is something almost no one expects. It is worth pausing on what the submarine service cost. The American submarine force was tiny, less than 2% of the Navy's men. Yet it sank more than half of all the Japanese ships destroyed in the war, strangling an island nation that lived or died by the sea. The price was brutal. 52 American submarines were lost, with thousands of men still entombed in them on the floor of the Pacific to this day. Chester Nimitz Jr. knew those men. He had commanded in the same waters that swallowed them. That he survived at all, famous name or not, was partly luck, and he never forgot it. After the war, Chester Nimitz Jr. stayed in the Navy he had served so well, rising steadily on his own record. He commanded again during the Korean War, and in 1957 he reached the rank of Rear Admiral, 2 stars, the same blue uniform his legendary father had worn, earned this time by the son in his own right. Then, still relatively young, he did something his father never did. He left the Navy entirely and walked into the business world, starting over in a place where the Nimitz name meant far less, to see what he could build with nothing but his own ability. And he built a great deal. Chester Nimitz Jr. became a sharp, demanding executive, eventually rising to lead a major American corporation, the kind of second career that would have been a triumph for any man, let alone one who could simply have rested on his father's fame. He was known as exacting, honest, and quietly proud, a man who expected of others what he had always demanded of himself. He had escaped the shadow completely. By any measure, the boy born under the heaviest name in the Navy had become his own man, twice over, in war and in peace. His relationship with his father was its own quiet story. Fleet Admiral Nimitz was a reserved, disciplined man, not given to public warmth, and he was careful never to use his position to advance his son. He would not pull strings, would not interfere, would not let anyone whisper that the boy had been carried. That distance was its own kind of gift. It forced Chester Jr. to stand entirely on his own, and it meant every medal he won was unmistakably his. When the great Admiral died in 1966, he left behind a son who had never needed his help, which may be the proudest thing a father like that could say. Through all of it, there was Joan. He had married Joan Leyburn in 1938, before the war, a young woman born in Nicaragua to British parents, and she had waited for him. Through the silent terror of the submarine patrols, when weeks would pass with no word, and every wife understood her husband might already be on the bottom of the sea. They stayed married for more than 60 years. They raised a family, built a life, and grew old together. They had survived the very worst the century could throw at a young couple, and come out the other side, still holding on to each other. The decades passed, as they do. Chester and Joan grew old in comfort and in love, surrounded by the long evidence of a life well spent. But a war hero ages like anyone else. The eyes that had once read enemy ranges through a periscope began to fail. The body that had climbed submarine ladders grew frail. By the turn of the new century, the man who had hunted destroyers in the South China Sea could barely see across a room, and the woman who had waited out his patrols lived in constant pain. They had outlived the war, the careers, and most of their friends. What they had not lost was each other, or their clear minds. By the start of 2002, the years had caught up with both of them. Chester Nimitz Jr. was nearly 87, almost blind, his hearing nearly gone, his heart failing, his body shutting down by degrees. Joan, 3 years older, was worn down by an illness that had left her in constant pain. They had lived full, complete lives. They had buried friends and watched their world narrow to a single room. And the proud old admiral who had once commanded a submarine in combat was not willing to spend his final months being slowly erased, one failing organ at a time. So he and Joan made a decision together. On the 2nd of January, 2002, Chester and Joan Nimitz ended their own lives, together in their home in Massachusetts, in a planned and deliberate act. He was 86, she was 89. They left letters explaining themselves with the same calm clarity the Admiral had brought to everything else, Forshor, Tors, stating plainly that they had chosen to leave on their own terms, while they still could, rather than be pulled apart and worn down by age and illness. By every account, it was not despair. It was a decision made by two clear-minded people who had been together 63 years and would not face the end helplessly or alone. And that decision is where people stop and disagree, gently and seriously. To some, it was a final act of courage and love, two people refusing to let illness strip away their dignity, choosing the time and the manner of their own leaving, together, as they had done everything for 63 years. To others, it crosses a line no one should, a thing that faith and law and conscience all warn against, no matter how much pain stands behind it. The son of Admiral Nimitz, who had faced enemy destroyers without flinching, faced his own death the same way. Whether that was bravery or something harder to name, each of us has to decide for ourselves. There is a way of seeing his whole life through that last act. Chester Nimitz Jr. had spent his years refusing to be passive, refusing to let a famous name decide his fate, refusing to wait for the enemy to find him. He went and found the enemy. He went and built his own career, and at the end, facing the one enemy no one defeats, he refused to simply wait for that one too. You do not have to agree with what he did to see the single thread running through all of it. The man met everything in his life head on, including its end. Whether that was the right way to leave, only he could judge. And he did. Rear Admiral Chester William Nimitz Jr. died on January 2, 2002, at the age of 86, beside Joan, his wife of 63 years. He had worn the Navy Cross and 3 Silver Stars, commanded a submarine in the deadliest waters of the Pacific, risen to 2 stars, and built a second life in the business world, all in the shadow of the most famous Admiral America ever produced and never once swallowed by it. Late in his life, he recorded his memories for the Navy's oral history, his voice steady, naming the boats and the men. He spent his whole life proving he was more than a name. In the end, he was. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the silent service, on the submarines, or anywhere beneath or upon the Pacific, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.